Hello and welcome everybody to the Merry Corncrakes, the affiliated to the Corncrake magazine, which exists to promote great English literature both in the past, present, and inspiring current and future artists in that very vein. And today I have a really fantastic guest to discuss something which I think many of us are interested in. Many of us read and write fantasy, science fiction stories, exploring imaginary worlds and learning about different civilizations, fictional civilizations. But as a writer, it can be quite a daunting task to develop a history, a language, a whole culture, never mind several, if you're writing a fantasy story. And so the topic of this conversation is world building. How do you go about doing it? And with me, I have, very delighted to say, I have Alex, also known as AR Green. Hello, Alex. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. What about yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And
Good.
it's been a real pleasure over the last week or so. I have been reading your story, which will be in this month's edition of the Corncrake, A Song of Spring, A Sword Fit for a King, Part 1. And this is the first installment of several parts which will be in the Corncrake. And reading it, what really struck me, or one of the things that struck me, is that the amount of detail and thought you had put into the world in which the story takes place. And so, by way of opening, I wanted to kind of ask you, how did you go about that? Was that like, did you, when you sat down, did you write the story and then come up with the world building, or did you develop a world and the story arose from it? What was the kind of relationship there between story and world building?
Well, the world kind of originated from an idea, really, and the idea that I'm specifically focused on is cyclical history.
Mm,
And basically, I wanted a sort of place to actually start building this world. So it ends up, it almost feels like world building is kind of a bit like a combination of both gardening and cooking. It might be a bit of a strange way to think about it, but it's kind of along the lines of one of the things that I've tried a little bit and just sort of dip my hand into is poetry a tiny bit. And
mm,
poetry very much feels like you're capturing lightning in a bottle. It's literally a bang, it happens. You get it down on the page as quickly as you can. At least that's been my experience when I've been trying to do it. And then and that's it done. It's sort of out of the way. Whereas world building obviously is a much, much bigger endeavor. You
mm.
still do sometimes get those flashes of lightning, and you've got to capture them and then try and work out how you're going to fit them into what you're trying to build. But it very much feels like the storytelling grows like a garden. So your first steps is your world building, which is basically the land that your garden's actually going to grow on.
Mm.
So you set about and you're raising up your mountains, creating your rivers all at the same time, just basically pushing through it in your mind, literally almost trying to embody it. I think as far as humans go, it's the closest you can ever get to standing next to the divine and just sort of looking down and saying, right, I'm trying to build something here within my own headspace.
Mm.
And it is just a whole other level of creative endeavor compared to, like I say, poetry, which can be truly beautiful, but it's just not the same as sitting down and saying, right, I'm actually going to try and create this whole world and have it function.
Well, it's interesting you kind of say it's almost being as as close as a human could get to be to the divine, because I think of Tolkien and his various lectures, such as on fairy stories and elsewhere. He talks about sub-creation. So he believed that only God can truly create, because for him creation is producing out of nothing, whereas
Yes.
all creatures are always giving form and shape, or new form and shape, to what already exists. But the author of or the fantasy author who develops in his or her mind a secondary world, a world which isn't the real world but has its own internal laws and so on, and is coherent in itself, is, out of all of the artists, the closest to that initial creation. So I think that's a very interesting insight that you've had through your own process in it.
Yes, it very much, like I say, it's shaping the land, and you
Mm,
just, when you're actually starting to, within the creative process of like creating your world, then is when, like you say, you aren't the creator. You can't actually create something completely unique and new. Everything's been done before, and it's a
mm,
case of that's when you're literally going out, getting your seeds, planting them in the ground that you've tilled, and saying, right, something's going to grow here. But it will very much be something that is based upon your understanding and knowledge.
mm. So,
You can't.
sorry, go ahead, Alex.
You're right. I was about to say you can't actually step up into the shoes of God and actually be like,
Mhm.
right, I'm going to make something 100% original, 100% new.
No, and in some ways, I think that's a good thing because I wouldn't
Yeah,
trust most of us to create whatever we would create out of nothing at all.
yeah.
Would probably not be as good as what we've got. But with that in mind, I'm intrigued in terms of, you've said you had this idea that you wanted to explore in this story of cyclical history. So then, when you have that, and for those who are watching, cyclical theories of history, rather than suggesting that everything is progressing or inevitably going to progress, a cyclical theory of history will say that actually individuals, governments, civilizations rise and fall. They are born, they have a zenith potentially, and then they die, they decay and die, and thus the cycle goes on and on and on. And that can be expanded to micro levels, macro levels, depends on the theorist. But you have this idea, and how then does that? How did you start then the world building process from that idea?
The world building process is it's kind of a bit of a tricky one to get into because it does go into
Mhm.
spoilers if I discuss it too much. But
You can you
like
can
you say,
say you can say a few here. It's not a problem if you want to share a bit.
it's along the ideas of, like you say, the rise and fall of empire. We currently live in an age that is, and is certainly within the last 100 or so years, we have been completely taken in by the idea that history is a linear progression that is just continually marching forward.
Hmm.
Whereas I recently actually read Jurassic Park, and one of the things that interested me about that was he continually goes on about fractals and chaos theory. And I
Yes.
think with that in mind, I think cyclical history would possibly actually be better named as fractal history, because it's a case of it's not always going to perfectly repeat, but it's the same pattern again and again and
Mm.
again. No matter how close in you get to it, no matter how far out you zoom out, it's the same pattern, just repeating endlessly.
Yes. There's a life cycle to things which
Yes.
everything experiences, and I think one of the things which at the very outset of the story is kind of indicated about the world is that it's in a state of decline, or there have been great civilizations before. This is all near the very beginning. There's rumors of a great civilization that is in this land, which is now a kind of wasteland, a haunted land, and the heroes are going to have to journey to that place, into the
Yes.
ruins of this once great place. But even within the place which they're leaving, the capital, there's this sense in which it's a bit tired, it's a bit old, it's um, there was once kind of great warriors and leaders, and now it's a fading dynasty, and the whole world is not quite what it once was.
Yes, to some degree. The part of it is that the way that I want to run the story is
Hmm.
it's broken down into four parts. So you've got spring, basically spring, summer, autumn, winter. The book right now is obviously set in the season of spring. And I
Mm.
think there'll be I'm hoping that I'll be able to create a couple more stories within this setting before then moving into the next setting. That's my aim.
Mm.
And it's basically a case of these are the civilization that we're looking at now are the men of spring. They're the people that have survived the winter and they're then going to
Mm.
rise up to become the civilization of summer. And then you're going to follow it on through the civilizational cycle.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. So in a way, when we first meet them, they have just left the winter, so there is that sense of, oh, something has passed, but now we're going to see the beginnings of something new.
Yeah,
New
the
shoots are
best
going to spring.
the best way I can think to describe it is there's paintings somewhere of Rome immediately following the fall during the medieval period, when you have these monumental structures with wooden buildings that have been built inside, and you've got miniature cities that were built inside the ruins of Roman structures.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the kind of place where the first story is set.
Mm. Very much so, and so I mean that is very interesting in itself. That in terms of where in the civilizational cycle and the kind of history and the historical tropes that you're kind of drawing on there. And I guess that leads to my kind of next question in terms of, so it seems to me very influenced by medieval history, the kind of world that this is set in. It seems like although there's different or even older history, maybe like Saxon history
Yes.
as well. And I wondered why you had chosen to kind of model it off those sources or influences rather than another time period, whether in this part of the world or elsewhere.
It's quite heavily influenced by the Saxon period, and it's specifically because the Saxons and the early British kingdoms that came about after the fall of Rome are kind of what I'm drawing inspiration from in terms of my civilization that's just come out of the winter and is now going into the spring. So you had the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that rose up out of the ashes of the Roman Empire and then went on throughout their spring to then create England, which you then have the English civilization, which again reaches up into its summer and the heights of summer, and now we're quite clearly far into the autumn, maybe even beginning to touch onto the winter.
Aye, some would say winter, but that's another question. I mean, again, Tolkien and Lewis seem to contrast England and Britain, which is a kind of tantalizing thought. But I think that gets to something in the sense that the form of the world, or the kind of inspiration of the world, which manifests in its form. So for example, the warriors wearing kind of Saxon-like or knightly-like clothes, as opposed to samurai clothes, bears with it some of those ideas, because in our minds we associate that rise and fall, that sense of cyclical history, which I think is very much in Saxon literature, with the form itself. There's a certain way the men who wear those things carried themselves, the world they existed in. If you try to tell the same story, but with a very different kind of set of influences and inspirations, it might not match up so easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I found funny with the inspirations is, obviously I took quite a lot of inspiration from Tolkien, because he was doing a kind of similar endeavor to some degree with the way that he created Lord of the Rings. Obviously, he was going back through all of the old mythology and then trying to create a story based upon the mythology to some degree, which was quite a bit of an odd experience, because there was a couple of times when I was researching things where I basically came to Tolkien from the back end rather than directly through his work. So there was one thing in particular that I was researching, which was a Anglo-Saxon Celtic god. And when I was going through, literally I was just browsing through the Wikipedia to get a bit more information on the god and say, like, so what were they about? And when I reached the end and found the sources page, one of the sources was actually J.R.R. Tolkien had written up, translated one of the early mythologies for this specific god, and I was just sat there just like, and I think even within the Wikipedia it made mention of saying, this was supposed to have been it's directly influenced the story and the naming of this character and their character traits. And it's just that kind of thing where it's like, I didn't intend on finding you here, but oh well.
That's quite amazing, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It was definitely a good sign that I was
Mhm.
kind of feeling like I'm on the right path here. I'm going the right
Mm.
way.
I mean, I guess this leads to a kind of question that many fantasy authors face, whether they like him or not, is Tolkien in terms of world building is the gold standard, and there were fantasy writers before him, but none had ever developed so rich a history and set of cultures and uh, m- overarching narrative, cosmological narrative, myths and legends
Mm,
within a fantasy setting before, and he developed languages as well.
yeah, but
How
supposedly the whole thing came out of the language first.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's some debates about the ordering, but you're right. The language is it's so bound up with the actual stories
Yeah,
that are being told there that um, actually you could argue at certain points the story flows from certain linguistic functions even.
yeah,
Um, I remember somebody pointing out Tom Bombadil. He always speaks in a poetic verse,
mm,
and it actually mirrors Anglo-Saxon verse in terms of its meter and rhythm,
yeah,
uh, which is very distinctive. Which then tells you something about Tom Bombadil and what
yeah,
he's kind of conveying. But be that as it may, Tolkien casts a long shadow, and it can be very daunting. Not in two ways. One is, okay, can I ever compare my world to that of Middle Earth? But secondly, how can I engage with Tolkien's influences without becoming a copy or a parody of Tolkien, but without becoming fan fiction?
yes,
And I
yeah.
don't think your story is fan fiction, but I'm interested to know, was that something that you've had to wrestle with, um, or more broadly, how did you kind of take on those things from Tolkien without becoming just copying Tolkien?
Yeah, I think part of it is that a lot of people, when they set out to do something along the lines of that, they end up copying the wrong thing. What you want, at least from my view and in my opinion, the thing that you want to aim to copy is the methodology, not the
Mm,
actual whole story itself to some degree. But in terms of wrestling with it, I kind of have just accepted you are always going to live in his shadow.
mm.
There is no escaping it. So just embrace it.
So when you talk about the methodology as opposed to the content, what specifically about his methodology did you take on?
One of the specific methodologies that I took on was in order to enrich your world building. What I've found is a good way to come up with place names is to do what Tolkien did, which was basically look at the way that old civilizations used to actually name locations nearby where they were living.
Mm,
So, for instance, you would have things like, say you had a river by a hill, it would literally, the locals would just refer to it as river by the hill. And it's
yeah.
then you then end up with funny little quirks of language whereby, like, I guarantee there will be plenty of rivers across all of the world that are just called river in the local dialect that someone that has then come along and conquered them went, what's that there? And they go, river. And they go, oh, that's a nice word. We'll use that. And that's what it's called now.
Mm, yeah. And many towns as well. It's
Yeah.
like if you look at the many towns, it's like, oh, this is the Goose Town or the Barley
Yeah.
Town or so on and so forth. Or this is so Ham is like household, isn't it? So it's like
Yeah.
Birmingham. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, this is just the name of the guy whose farm it was at
Yeah.
that point."
Uh, that's another thing that very often happens. I believe that ton's another one. Any town ending
Mm,
with ton on the end is Anglo-Saxon suffix for town. So it would
right.
literally be like calling it, Marsh Town. Yeah,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Well,
But
so
yeah,
these days we're literally just saying like the town of Marshtown.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's the exact same as the problem we have with chainmail, which is in
Mm,
the medieval period, mail just referred to, it literally was chain. So we're
mm.
effectively calling it in the modern tongue chain.
changing. They would look at us and think, what kind of idiots have we met in the 21st century?
Exactly,
Um,
exactly.
but so that's quite interesting then. So you drew on a kind of deep historical custom and convention, and then that gives a kind of deeper history to what you're doing, and it also avoids maybe a certain kind of superficial or confected name for the cities.
Yes, exactly. You avoid
Hmm.
coming up with the crazy fantasy names, and you stick to something that is
Hmm.
relatively close to reality. Like a lot of the town names within my setting were literally just a case of me looking through Anglo-Saxon words, saying, right, there's a word that I like that
Yeah.
is a feature of that location. That is what that place is now called. I think
And
the sorry, go on.
continue your point. I was going to move to a slightly different thing.
I was just going to say the capital city of me setting is Tree Stall, which literally
Hmm.
is just me smashing the words tree and stool together and saying, "There you go, it's Tree Stool," because the throne
Hmm.
is literally built into a tree,
Yeah,
and
that's
it's the
right.
seat.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's their seat of power. It's literally built into a tree, and the name of the capital is Tree Stool.
So then, you see, this is how you name places, but how did you decide what places you wanted within this world? Did you kind of draw a map or anything like that? Did you give different places a kind of historical bio that you draw on, or do you just kind of develop that as you go?
I initially drew a map, so I've got a map drawn out that lays out each of the
Mm,
different locations just to sort of give me an idea for when storytelling you want to be able to sort of look at it and go, how long is it actually going to take someone to go
mm,
from point A to point B? Because if you don't have that kind of mental image, you're really going to struggle to keep it consistent in terms of how long it takes people to travel between point A and point B.
mhm. I call this
And
the
it
D&D problem.
right.
D&D, it's very easy just to think, oh yeah, and I'll just travel to there now.
Yeah,
It's although in the world it should take a year. It's like, oh yeah, we're just there now. Let's start the
yeah.
story there. Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, that's it. Because obviously, one of the things of modernity is we've completely and utterly, totally forgotten how long it used to take to go from
Mm,
one place to another, and the logistics, the actual logistical nightmare of trying to get from one place to another. Because you go on a
mm,
journey, you think, right, yeah, there's always going to be food around, there's always going to be transport around. That's it, I'm sorted. And on top of that, in modernity, there'll even always be someone that speaks my language.
that's a good point. Yeah. Hmm. Whereas that, in actual fact, it was a pretty risky thing to go on the road. Uh, not least because of bandits and wild animals, but just because it was a long way and you don't know what you're going to meet. The towns that you've relied on in the past, things might have changed. So
Yeah,
it's you're very right. We take a lot for granted in our systems today.
yeah.
So you draw your map, and you've got your sense of the geography of the world. With each of the places, did you have a kind of uh, like sense of the history of each place before you started writing your story?
To some degree, this kind of plays into the whole cyclical idea of it. I've got a rough idea of what went on before,
Mm,
and it's just trying to sort of tease that out and work out exactly right. So, what was going on here before and what is going on here now? And it's trying to draw out and just paint a picture in your own mind of what has happened in this specific location throughout the ages and what's going
mm,
to, and it's trying to then cast that into the future and say what's going to happen going forward.
yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, and it's I guess the thing as well is that okay, you might build your world, but actually, as you write your story, you might end up changing aspects of it because you discover something that you hadn't seen before that might improve your world building, as it were. So it's not a static process. It might actually feed back into it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the nice things that you can do as well when you actually do encounter things like that is obviously I've got a location within my world called the Borderlands. It's based where the old empire is. There is probably going to be quite a few things within that area that change as I am writing it. And the way that the map is actually set up is the map was drawn by the people of Gulnorthia at a set time when they didn't have a full understanding of what is in that land. So they just have a rough idea of, yeah, there used to be a road here and a city here. We think it's still there, but they don't have a crystal clear, perfect image of what is there.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. So the map itself, which the reader might potentially be relying on, actually isn't a reliable map in totality.
No, which again, it's if you've ever looked at the maps that were drawn in the 1400s, yeah, it's accurate that they weren't 100% reliable, especially when you go back to the old-fashioned style of cartography. It's only with the advent of Google Earth that we've actually been able to map out the world and sort of say like, oh yeah, so that's actually what that shape is in reality, as opposed to we've kind of drawn an approximation and went, yeah, we think that's what that looks like.
Well, and also in terms of how you later maps place Jerusalem at the center of the world, because that's where Christ was resurrected. So it is the center point of reality. Whereas if you look at modern global maps, well, because Britain set the time zones essentially, that becomes the center point of the map. So it changes. It conveys a lot of values and meaning just in the way that you present the land itself, even if it was the same.
Yeah, definitely. But to be fair, Jerusalem never moved. England's always been Jerusalem.
Said like a
But yeah,
proud Englishman. Yes.
yes. Okay. So with really old maps, prior to like the 1400s and going further back, maps used to work a very different way from how we envisioned a map. Because obviously we look at a map and we think of the bird's eye view. We go, look, you can see the entire world and it's all here on this page. But you go back to the time before we even had flight, and that becomes an awful lot more difficult. So the way that old maps used to be drawn was they were a series of landmarks, and you would move from one landmark to the next, and that was how your map was drawn out. Which it's very, very, I imagine it would work quite well for a storytelling perspective, but as someone in the modern age trying to look at it and understand that this is a map, it would probably get quite confusing.
It would be very confusing, but I wonder if it reflects a general shift in mentality from what would you say? Somebody like Henry Bergson might talk about it in terms of a subjective view of the world, where it's how you experience it,
Yeah,
which defines it, to a more objective or abstracted view of the world, where we objectively mark it out both in time and space, and there's a distance between the person and the world around them.
yeah, I think that would be a
The
very good way
top-down
to
map
describe
kind
it.
of reflects that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we are just about at the end of our conversation. Just a question before we kind of wrap things up. Other than Tolkien, do you have any good examples of world building that aspiring authors might want to look at?
Oh, I think Tolkien, like you say, is the absolute gold standard. I think C.S. Lewis would probably be quite a good one as well for aspiring writers to look at in terms of the world building that can be done. I think if you want something within a modern setting, I would actually suggest Jurassic Park, because it is quite interesting and it's really it's just removed enough from reality to be slightly different.
Well, I think that's a very promising ending. Is there anything that you would like to promote other than your fine story, which everyone should read in the Corncrake?
I think my fine story at the Corncrake pretty much That's good enough for me. I don't really have anything else
Mhm.
going on at the minute. Maybe
Well,
in the
thank you.
future.
Well, we shall see. We will wait with anticipation. Thank you so much, Alex, for making the time. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed talking about world building, and I hope that this inspires those who are watching to go away and think about when they're writing stories or reading stories about the author's attempts to develop and construct a whole history and culture within their story. So thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you very much for having me. Merry
And thank
Christmas,
you
everyone.
and thank you everybody watching. We shall see you soon. Bye for now.